and welcome to my channel. Today I am joined by the amazing Jordan Harvey, and we are going to be talking about the differences in the adaptations of Percy Jackson versus Harry Potter. This is a part 2 video. For the first video we talked about the differences in the source material, and that is over on Jordan's channel, and that video will be linked down below, so you should 100% go and check that out, and also check her channel out as well because it's fantastic. So yeah, in this video we'll be talking about... I don't know what we're talking about.
The adaptations and how the same director screwed up the Percy Jackson films when he somehow managed to make the first Harry Potter films so good, and then he destroyed the Percy Jackson ones. How? Well, we're gonna find out.
I think that was good. I might keep that bit in of you doing that bit for the intro.
That's what we're doing today, folks. We're discussing how Jordan's heart was absolutely shredded by the creation of the Percy Jackson films, and I will never recover. That's what we're going to be talking about today.
Okay, yeah, that is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. So would you like to, do you want to introduce yourself then, or I don't know, do you want to do a little bit?
Hey guys, I'm Jordan, and I'm so glad to be back on Galatea's channel. I absolutely adore her content, and I am thrilled to be doing another video with her, and I'm super excited to be doing this video, obviously, if you saw that intro, because I was absolutely destroyed when the Percy Jackson films came out because they were utter garbage. And they were directed by the same guy as the first 2 Harry Potter films, so we'll be chatting about what went wrong and what went right.
So I think the first obvious and probably most noticeable difference in the adaptations was that although the book characters of both Percy Jackson and Harry Potter were 11, 12 roughly, I think they're both 11 at the beginning of the books, they kept this the same in the movies with Harry Potter, kept them age 11, but in the Percy Jackson movies they were far, far, far older than that. I think they were meant to be 16 or something in the Percy Jackson.
I think they were meant to be 16, and then the actors that played them were in their early 20s. So instead of 12-year-olds or 11-year-olds being played by 11-year-olds, you had what was meant to be 16-year-olds being played by 22-year-olds.
Yeah, which obviously then you either have to change the whole story and plot and how the characters interact, because otherwise it looks really ridiculous. If you could keep it the same, but it's a bit ridiculous because of the age difference and everything. So that is a huge, And
I think that influenced a lot of the changes and modifications that they made to the Percy Jackson movies that they weren't, or that they didn't have to make to the Harry Potter movies.
Yeah, I think one of the most noticeable changes in the character dynamics from book to movie in Percy Jackson was the relationship, of course, between him and Annabeth. Because in the books, I think they eventually develop a romantic relationship, but that's not till far later. And in the first book, they're certainly friends, I think reluctant friends really at the beginning actually as well. Whereas, yeah, in the movies it's instantly sort of, there's all this tension, all this sexual tension between them, which kind of, it's a bit of a shame because you lose that really innocent aspect to their friendship and a really good foundation for what will later become a relationship.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point because a lot of the tension between those 2 characters, well, at first it's tension of will they become friends, will they be able to work together, but once they do become friends, it's the tension of hoping that one day they will get together because you can see the chemistry between them, but they're young, they're kids, and so while you're hoping that they will get together, it's this tension of shipping them while they, Percy Jackson is kind of interested, but they're growing up, and that is kind of the source of the tension. It's all kind of within you. Whereas in the movies, because they've aged them up and because they're kind of that age where they're, kind of starting to date and whatever, Percy and Annabeth, the tension is between those 2 characters. It's that sexual tension that you mentioned, and it's a bit unfortunate because, yeah, it does lose the innocence of their kind of friendship first, but it also kind of undermines the beautiful relationship that they end up working towards, because it doesn't start out as a friendship. It just, it's completely hollow and undermined by something far less, love-based and more lust-based.
Exactly. I'm jumping around a bit here, but just before I forget as well, it changes so one of the main driving points of the first book or film is Percy's mum goes missing, which has so much more of an impact when he's an 11-year-old boy and he's lost his mother. It means so much more as a child, whereas that sort of whole dynamic is completely changed when he's already sort of a young man who's lost his mother. It changes it hugely, and changes, that, I think, it's kind of sort of a very important point. It changes the meaning of the story, rather than a little boy learning to be on his own and he's without his mother for the first time, really, sort of, and, the feelings there with losing her. It's very different when he's older, I think.
I think that is absolutely right, and I think that that's such an important part of growing up when you're 11 and 12 is slowly becoming independent, whereas when you're 16, it's more about the relationships that you're making with your peers, and that's kind of the coming of age story of that age in your life. Whereas, when you're a kid, it's all about growing up and slowly becoming independent. So I think that is such a crucial thing that you touched on. And I think that there's a lot to dive into as far as relationships between Harry and his parents or the absence of his parents, and Percy and the absence of his parents. So if you want to touch on that, I think that's super important.
So both Percy and Harry's mother held a real importance in their stories, in the first book specifically as well. So in the first book we have Harry, and he finds the Mirror of Erised, which has got obviously his parents in it and his mother, and he learns that she died to save him, and she's sort of intangible, because she's dead, she's unreachable, and he's almost trying to get in contact with her with this whole mirror plot that's going on. With Percy as well, we have a similar thing with his mother's been stolen and taken away, and she again is unreachable and has been taken by the god of the dead, so it's a similar thing there.
I think it's important to note that Lily and Sally are also these very idealized forms of mothers. Lily, because she sacrifices herself for Harry at, the start, or whatever, at the incident where Voldemort tried to kill them, she makes the ultimate sacrifice, her life, for Harry. And I think that it's kind of the same with Sally. She endures this very brutal relationship with a guy who's abusive, and she, has to lead this very kind of sad life where she's constantly making sacrifices to protect her son. And I think that that's an important parallel between the two stories, and one that's very crucial in both of their relationships with their moms. Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, Percy's mother has more importance in his story in the sense that she propels a lot of the plot, her going missing and been taken. But Harry as well, there's a similar thing with her, he's also searching for his mother, but in a different way, because she's already dead, but he's still searching for her and through the mirror and everything. So that's interesting.
It's an internal versus an external conflict for sure in the two, but I think it's definitely a driving point in both.
Yeah, there's similarities in the relationships with both Percy and Harry and each of their fathers. So both of them, it felt, were very much trying to live up to the legacy of an amazing dad, really. So we have James, who was an outstanding Quidditch player. Everyone, well, not everyone, but a lot of people loved him. He was meant to be really talented and funny and all this stuff. But he was also dead, which adds this divine aspect to him, that he's again unreachable, untouchable, and really makes him seem more perfect than perhaps he was. And also we see Harry trying to live up to him by, again, he's fascinated by Quidditch, and particularly the fact that his dad was so good at Quidditch, he wants to sort of follow in his footsteps. We have a similar thing with Percy, with his dad's a literal god, so again he's divine in a similar way that James was, but he's not dead, he's an actual god, again sort of unreachable, untouchable, and again outstanding because he's a god. So it's Percy sort of trying to impress him, and live up to him, and both boys seem to be, even though their dads are sort of unreachable, seem to be trying to get their dad's attention and make their fathers proud, even though their dads aren't around. So
I think that's a really interesting point and is another crucial aspect to both of their characters, and I think that this was handled very poorly in the Percy Jackson movies, because I think that another key aspect of their relationships with their fathers is, this idealization at first, and then slowly in Harry Potter and less slowly in Percy Jackson, it's this disillusionment of that idea, because in the Harry Potter books, James turns out to be not the man that Harry once thought with his relationship with Snape, and he's not this perfect guy, and there's this slow kind of disillusionment of that kind of perfect father figure. And in the Percy Jackson books, at first Percy believes his father to be this amazing godlike figure, and then he slowly realizes that all of these fathers and mothers, all of these gods don't really care for their children in the way that he wants them to, and there's that level of disillusionment as well. But it's handled so poorly in the Percy Jackson movies, because in the movies they humanize the gods in a lot of ways, and there's this caring, father that cannot have a relationship. There's this law where he can't have a relationship with Percy, but he wants to, whereas in the books it's more of an absent relationship, and it's not quite that he doesn't want, or it's not quite that he can't have a relationship with Percy, it's more that he just doesn't care to, which I think is an interesting aspect of Percy's relationship with his father that they didn't explore in the same way in the movies.
I think that did have a huge impact on the story as well, because by making Percy's father not as flawed as he was in the books, because I think that, and again with Harry Potter, that whole storyline there, it sort of reflects, again, growing up. So when you're very young, a lot of people think their parents are perfect, and then as you grow up, you perhaps see flaws that you didn't, or that they don't know everything, or they're not, completely perfect. So it's interesting. I think that's quite important for a series of books for kids as they grow up, and sort of changing that changes more than just a simple thing in the story. I think it changes almost the whole meaning of it in a way.
For sure, and that was one of the huge problems I had with the way that the gods were handled in the Percy Jackson movies. We're going to go more into that in a bit, with how these kind of changes affected things in the story, but I think that the gods were handled in such a way that it really affected not only, their characters, but the young characters and the themes of the story.
One thing I noticed in how they changed the characters from books to movies, so in both Percy Jackson and Harry Potter, all three of the kids are quite, with the exception of Annabeth maybe, all of the kids are quite ordinary looking, perhaps even geeky looking in some instances. Like Harry's very geeky looking, Ron again, even Hermione especially, she's quite geeky looking, and then we have Grover, he's meant to be quite odd looking, and basically all of them. But then in the movies, which I guess sort of always happens with movies, they made particularly the three from Percy Jackson a lot better looking than they were supposed to be, which probably had partly to do with their age as well. But whereas in Harry Potter, I think they were a lot more ordinary looking, apart from Emma Watson, who sort of was always she was always really too pretty for Hermione, but the two boys really were quite sort of normal looking, which is what Harry and Ron were supposed to look like. But with Percy Jackson, Percy was quite good looking, and then Grover as well was quite good looking, which they were not supposed to be at all. Particularly Grover, I think he wasn't meant to be good looking at all.
Yeah, Grover was supposed to have like a wispy beard and acne. He was supposed to be very kind of odd looking, and it was a reflection of his character. Whereas in the movies, they made him quite good looking, and his personality reflected that in the sort of confidence and sometimes even like arrogance that he had, which he did not have in the books whatsoever.
Yeah, from what I remember, they turned him into a bit of a flirt, didn't they, in the movie? Well, I think wasn't he flirting with all the girls in bikinis at one point, whereas in the books he was like really awkward, really a bit terrified of everything, and I couldn't see him chilling out with loads of hot chicks and been able to sort of be really confident about it. So they changed that.
And a lot of his humor as well, it was a lot more like cool and one-liners and all of that. And while he was afraid of certain things, it wasn't to the extent that, you know, it was in the books. I think another thing in regards to their looks is that in Harry Potter they kept it a lot more truthful to the books in the way that they casted the characters. Ron, Harry, and Hermione are all described similar to how they look. Obviously Hermione's a little bit different, but the same with Draco and a lot of the kind of side characters as well. I think they were very truthful in casting to the way that they were described in the books. The same is not to be said with the Percy Jackson books or movies whatsoever. Percy Jackson is a lot more good looking, as you mentioned. Annabeth is supposed to have gray eyes and blonde hair, which they weirdly made in the second movie and then not in the first one, and it's like a little too late for that, don't you think? But I think there's just so much outrage about it because it was such a defining feature that was described so many times in the books of her, was her gray eyes, her wise gray eyes, and her blonde hair. So they weirdly added that to the second movie with the same actress, but not to the first one. And same thing with Grover, I think they changed his race, but then also a lot of the kind of other characters like Clarice and Tyson in the second movie. Tyson's a lot more good looking than he was in the books, and Clarice is an actual babe in the movies, and in the books she's this kind of mean tyrant, like bodybuilder-esque woman, or kid I guess, not woman, but she's this kind of super strong buff girl who's mean, and in the movies, yeah, she's like this gorgeous babe, and it's like, I don't know about that.
That was something I did definitely notice, was the general attractiveness of the characters went up quite a lot with the Percy Jackson movies, I think. Just with the Percy Jackson movies, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like in the movies they sacrifice the characters a lot in order to make them funnier or seem more sure of themselves. So Percy seemed more really like sort of confident, a little bit cocky sometimes, particularly him and Annabeth flirting and everything like that. He lost a lot of his sort of vulnerability as well with that he had in the books. And Grover, again, they seemed to sacrifice that just so he could say a few funny things, really.
And I think that extends a lot to the gods as well. These gods are supposed to be characters that are intimidating and mysterious, and except for like Dionysus and a few like specific gods, they're meant to be, you know, kind of hands-offish from the main characters. And a lot of them have this like very regal vibe that they're kind of untouchable. They're gods. They're, you know, they're not at all the same as humans. Whereas in the movies, it's not the case at all. While in the books they're kind of humanized by some of the cultural things that are American, like with Dionysus wearing like a cheetah print shirt and a lot of the clothing elements, like Ares on his bike with his like, you know, leather vest thing, like a lot of those elements are changed and they do humanize them a bit and add to their character. I think a lot of the kind of humor from the movies was from the gods and the way that they were handled, which completely undermined the kind of characters that they were in the books, which is kind of this aloof, standoffish, immortal being. In the movies, they're always cracking jokes and they're completely undermining that.
Yeah. One thing I did want to say that I remember is even with Dionysus, who even in the books he's meant to be quite a funny character and seem like a bit of a loser, Percy makes that mistake of thinking of that way of him in the books, and I do remember quite clearly it's like this weird eerie change, and doesn't he get loads of visions of people like being strangled by vines and all this stuff, and like people dying in horrific ways that Dionysus is giving him, saying, no, I'm really this immense being, don't mess around with me. Which even for a character like that, there's still that godlike aspect of huge like strength and intimidation and unknowable power, which is not reflected at all with really any of the gods in the movies.
I think that was something that really undermined a lot of the tension in the movies because it was this constant source of tension in the books. They are gods, like they're supposed to be powerful. Another thing that I wanted to touch on as far as the heroes and the gods and the relationships between the two is that a lot of the driving conflict, like we mentioned in the kind of family aspect, is from Percy finding out who his father is. That's a huge part of the first book, is the gods claiming their children. It's a theme throughout, and I think it's an important one because it's about these kids finding out who they are, which is important thematically, obviously, for a coming of age story. But then in the movies, it's handled much differently. And a lot of the characters like Luke, for example, and Percy find out early on who their parents are, which completely undermines a lot of that message and a lot of the tension, because I think that is such an important part of the books. So later on, Percy, I forget which book it is, but Percy basically forces the gods to claim all of the kids, which is this huge moment for a lot of the kids that are kind of stuck in limbo. And I think that that is such an important part of the development of the stories, which is completely undermined in the movies because that is not set up really at all and is just kind of this weak element that I think they toss around but is not taken seriously.
Yeah, it makes the gods more part of the story as well. The fact that, as you said, there's this huge sort of tension going on and how sort of show how different they are and how little they care about their children. And to add that, well, to take that away in the movie sort of makes the gods less important, really.
Another thing that I think the books do well in regards to the gods is that they seem to be a lot more truthful to the Greek gods, whereas in the movies, the kind of mythology is handled with less care. For example, in the books, Hades is in the underworld. He's not in hell, he's in the underworld, which has 3 different levels and is very similar to the myths of the underworld. Whereas in the movies, I think they literally say hell and he's this satanic being. He's not evil in the books, no more than any of the other gods are evil. He suffers from the same things that immortality brings him, and in fact he's almost a sympathetic character because he was banished kind of to the underworld, whereas his brothers get to live above ground. This is, you know, his shackles almost. So he is almost the sympathetic character, whereas we do not get that at all in the movies, and he becomes a source of conflict. He's kind of the villain, but in the books, Ares is more of the villain in the first kind of book.
Yeah, I think with the movies, what I got from it is that they seem to mix the characters of Hades and Ares for the movie. So they made him like quite violent and aggressive and everything when, you know, like the god of war was. And that's a shame as well. That's one of the things I actually really liked about the Percy Jackson books, was how in the Percy Jackson books I found it really interesting how the gods were modernized, and it was really creative seeing sort of like, oh, how is this god gonna translate into the modern world? Like Ares being sort of like portrayed as like a thug on a motorbike, really, as the god of war, and how he was modernized. And you lost a lot of that, and the interesting sort of little character developments and the aspects of their character I felt didn't really come across in the movie.
I think another interesting aspect of the books and the movies and how they were translated is the violence. For example, in Harry Potter, I think that it's a much slower build to violence. In the books especially, it takes its time kind of, you know, introducing Harry to the world, and then the slow build, and even the first book is not super violent, which makes sense because he's an 11-year-old kid. While it does have some elements of action and violence, I think that the books do a really good job of building slowly towards that as Harry grows, which makes sense for his character. Percy Jackson, on the other hand, is a lot more violent from the get-go, which I think makes sense for, you know, the setting that it was written in and who it was written for. A lot of North American audiences have come to expect and are desensitized to violence, so to kind of catch the reader and pull them in, it's a lot more common to see violence as a starting kind of point of action. But in the books, it's a lot more understated, I think, than we see in the movies. In the books, the fight scene at the beginning where Harry kills his math teacher is very short. It's not super, like, it's not described violently at all. It's basically he clicks open a pen and slices her. In the movies, however, it is a lot more overstated, and they add a lot of action throughout. The book is almost more diplomatic, where there is violence throughout with the Minotaur and with Harry, you know, killing his math teacher, but it's more about Harry clearing his name and his father's name and stopping a war between the gods before it can break out. He's trying to stop violence rather than start it. And I think Harry, it's a little bit of the opposite. It's a slower build to the violence, but the violence is definitely there and the action is there, both in the movies and in the books. That's another important point with aging up the characters, is that in the Percy Jackson books, like in the Harry Potter books, it kind of builds towards more graphic violence in the end. While it never gets super graphic, because of course they are middle grade books, it does have a little bit more of a climb. But while that is the case for, you know, Harry Potter both books and movies, they couldn't do the same with the Percy Jackson movies because they aged up the characters. So to have kind of book one violence and conflict, you know, they wouldn't be able to do that because the characters are so much more competent. They're 16. You couldn't have the same amount of, you know, action and conflict that you would have for an 11-year-old for a 16-year-old, which is why I think so many of the changes that they made kind of, you know, edged on more violent and more action-y. Not only to be a little bit more, you know, fantasy-esque, I think, and generic for the audience that they were trying to get, but I think it's also because they wouldn't have been able to do the same conflict in the book that they would, you know, in the movies because of the age difference.
Yeah, I feel like with the Percy Jackson movies, it was almost, they tried to go all out for the very first movie, so throw in as much action, as much special effects, and also as much story in it as you can to try and, I don't really know, to make the movie a success would seem to be the thing there, except, of course, by, you know, where do you go from there? It's almost like they put everything into it, and then it's like, well, how do you sort of proceed? Again, with the story as well, adding a lot of, I think, did they do that? Add story elements that only came in later books? Or did I get that wrong?
They changed a lot of the story elements that were there. They left out a lot of important things for future story, which is really dumb, but then they brought in certain elements, like they revealed certain things sooner, like they just changed a lot of the order of how things were revealed to the audience, which was bizarre.
Yeah, I think it was more just a complete, I think, lack of respect for the source material to just sort of bundle everything cool was almost what it felt like, I guess. Everything cool from the series and sort of put it into this movie, and it doesn't matter if it doesn't make sense or, you know, I guess any of that. And also I think that was part of aging the characters up. It's like, let's go for, you know, what's going to be the biggest hit. Oh, let's sort of make it a teenage movie now and put teenagers in there and add people like romance. Let's put romance in to make it a movie a hit. I don't know, it felt a little bit like that.
Yeah, I think that's hugely important what you just said. Respect for the source material and respect for the audience. I think that's why Harry Potter was so successful and got 8 movies out of 7 books, whereas Percy Jackson got 2 movies out of 5 books, was because in Harry Potter, I think it's because it was wildly successful, they were forced to respect the source material, but they also respected the audience. And in Percy Jackson, that was not the case at all. They had no respect for the source material. In fact, they almost spit on it. They take certain elements of the story that you're like, oh, I recognize that scene, and completely change it, or, you know, toy with the reader's expectations. It's almost arrogant that the way that they handled the source material of Percy Jackson, and I think that they didn't have the same respect for the audience that they did with Harry Potter. In Harry Potter, the first movie, they still take their time, maybe not as much as the books, but to really introduce the characters and the world, whereas Percy Jackson, it's thrown into it a lot sooner, and a lot of the elements are changed as you mentioned. there is very little respect for the audience that they'll, be willing to wait to learn about these things, and instead we're just giving action sequence after action sequence to desperately try to keep the viewers engaged and interested. So moving on from that, did we want to discuss the longevity? Because I think we've already touched on some of the points of, the adaptations and how, Harry Potter was able to get 8 movies out of 7 books, whereas Percy Jackson was only able to get 2.
Yeah, so I think to start, the success of Harry Potter was that, well, the books were so well written and also so well thought out. Like, every single book has a plot within it, but then, like we said in the other video, an overarching plot that links it all together. And the movie makers really respected this, and as they followed each plot so closely in the movies, it enabled them to go somewhere and for the movies to make sense and to sort of all culminate in the final films. And also the fact, of course, that they kept the characters the same age that they were in the books really enabled them to go somewhere with it, as it still made sense. They were at school, they're growing up until, they sort of reach adulthood. So yeah, I think there's that. The respect they had for the source material and how much they stuck to it really enabled them to continue doing it.
For sure, and in Percy Jackson, in the movies, they didn't even introduce the kind of central conflict, Kronos, who is the Titan that, the entire book series is building towards, until the second movie. They didn't introduce him at all in the first movie, which is hugely kind of problematic and an issue for, that kind of idea of building up towards something. It doesn't really set up sequels and in the same way that the books do, and it doesn't feel like it necessarily is as coherent or in a lot of ways it forced the second movie to do a lot of backpedaling and introduce a lot of the elements that are important to having it as a full series, which completely gave the second movie this horrible, trying to jam things in that should have already been in there vibe that, made it awful, which sucked.
No, I think that's definitely true, and I think, I think the Percy Jackson movies feel very confused. It's sort of like a random adventure in the first movie, and then a random, unconnected adventure in the second movie, which, just give slightly confused feel of do they really know what they're doing, whereas if they'd introduced Kronos in the first one, it connects it, links it, it's sort of one story that it's all, heading towards. It sort of makes sense as a narrative, which Harry Potter did so well, because of course Voldemort's introduced right from the beginning, and it really gives you a sense of this series is heading somewhere, what's going to happen, what's going to happen with this. Whereas Percy Jackson didn't have that. It didn't really have a sense of, the movies anyway, didn't have a sense of where is this series going, what's this leading to, not to the same extent.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to a respect of the source material and trusting that, it will be enough to build towards that. It almost felt like the creators of the first Percy Jackson movie didn't have faith that it would get a sequel enough to build in all of the information necessary to have this whole series.
Yeah, that's definitely true. It was almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They didn't quite think they'd get a second movie, so they tried to jam everything in, which of course made it, or at least get a series, which of course meant that they didn't really get a whole series out of it, because they messed it up by believing that, I guess.
Interesting element is how the visuals in the Harry Potter movies are different to the kind of visuals and aesthetics of the Percy Jackson films. And I think that if they had stayed more true to the source material in the Percy Jackson films, it would have been a lot closer to the Harry Potter ones. Of course, the aesthetics are going to be completely different because Harry Potter is so British, and a lot of the things that we discussed in my video of, being more traditional and being set in a castle, these are all elements that are going to visually kind of dictate how the movie is filmed. But but they also came out at a time where CG wasn't being used as much, and there were a lot of traditional effects that were used in the Harry Potter films and elevated with CG elements. So that, I think, really kind of dictated how the style of the Harry Potter films would be kind of told and communicated, which I think is awesome and why they're so visually iconic. Whereas with Percy Jackson, I think that they're a lot more generic because they leaned more heavily on CG elements and the practical effects were minimal. Percy Jackson also seemed to want to show off in its visuals a lot more than Harry Potter did in some senses. I think because Percy Jackson was such a high budget film, they felt the need to use as much CG as possible. So you have elements that weren't there in the books that they did, and it felt like it was to show off, like like the Hydra, for example, isn't even in the first books, but you have this whole fight sequence that was added that, you know, Harry's flying, which he's not allowed to do in the books because that's the realm of Zeus, and Zeus and Poseidon are warring, you know, which is a really cool element and limits him. Grover's the one who flies instead with the flying shoes from Hermes. I think it's from Hermes. I hope it's from Hermes. But in the movies, that's all, undermine all of that interesting kind of political stuff and a source of conflict to have a flashy action sequence, or that's what it felt like to me at least. By having, you know, the Hydras, which we all know, if you cut off a Hydra's head, it's gonna grow into two more, like, that's common knowledge, so that just kind of felt weak in general. But the fact that, you know, they add this whole other action sequence with, you know, this Hydra with a million heads and Percy flying, it just felt like it was there for the visual conflict and, you know, kind of to show off, rather than having the, you know, kind of strong political conflict that they set up in the books.
Yeah, I think a lot of that's definitely true with the visuals. I mean, Harry Potter was very lucky, and they also were very clever in how much they stuck to how the world had been set up in the books. So there's such a strong visual in the books, really, with how everything looked. You know, it's quite easy how everything looked old-fashioned. So, and I think that added to the success of the movies because it was so distinctive, and they really did make it as stereotypically sort of British as possible, with all these, like, either it was really grand castles, or it was really quaint cottages and cobbled streets, and, you know, or, so yeah, it had this whole really strong visual thing going on, which I think really did help and set it apart, made it seem unique and completely different, particularly when the movies first came out. Like, there's nothing really like it before, so it really did make it feel really unique and different, I think, so.
I think that was something that Harry Potter did so right, is it really respected the source material, and that's where the story and the characters are, like, that's why the story and the characters are so similar to the books. But what it did and what it realized is that film is such an important medium in expressing, you know, emotion through sound and visuals, and it really embraced that. So instead of changing elements, it filled in the things that you wouldn't be able to get from the book, that you would just be imagining in your head. So it took elements, you know, from the book as they described and created those, but it also filled in the rest of the world that you may have not been imagining while you were reading the story. It really embraced its medium, which I think is awesome.
To add on to what you were saying about it's sort of connected to the visuals in terms of Percy Jackson seemed to have a lot of fight scenes that weren't in the books, just to add cool visuals and action sequences. I think, and again, this is them not being respectful of the source material, but the first Harry Potter movie definitely felt very different. Like, it felt like a sort of heartwarming, family-friendly movie, despite there was a lot of dark things going on there, but it had a really heartfelt warmth to it, I think. Really, like, yeah, it felt very real in a way, and really emphasised friendship and family a lot, whereas the Percy Jackson movie seemed way more focused on cool fight scenes, rather than any sort of mood. And it definitely, I I mean, it wasn't as sort of family friendly, or not as, I mean, not that anything particularly bad happens in it, but it kind of didn't have that wholesome feeling. I think that's what I'm looking for, sort of wholesome feeling that the first Harry Potter movie did, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that does have to do with the source material too. I think that Harry Potter does take its time to really establish the world in a way that Percy Jackson doesn't necessarily. But I think that in general, it's kind of like what Hayao Miyazaki said in one of his interviews. There's this Japanese word called ma, and it's the space between the big moments that are really crucial in, you know, feeling the story. So it's like a clap. It's like, it's a lot more impactful, and you really get a sense of the clap because there's the space between when your hands hit together. So in Harry Potter, you get these moments. You get these moments of character building and world building where it's just the characters existing and, you know, learning to be friends with one another, building this world. And you don't really get that in the Percy Jackson movies. It's a lot faster and quicker, and it's on to the next thing, where the tension isn't able to build, and the world isn't able to build, and the relationships aren't able to build in the same way.
That was a really lovely description. I haven't heard that before, but yeah, it... What am I saying? Yeah,
right, it makes,
yeah, with the clap and everything. It's a really lovely description, and I think it's very true. And yeah, Percy Jackson felt very much a lot of payoff, but not much setup, whereas Harry Potter had a lot more setup, a lot more quiet times where you got to know the characters a lot better, and it made, when, you know, rather than everything happening all the time like Percy Jackson, there were less instances of dramatic things happening, but when they did happen, they had so much more impact, and also I think were more serious, and I feared for the characters more because they felt like more of a more like a bigger deal. So when something dramatic happened in Harry Potter, it's like, oh my god, something could really go wrong here. This feels quite serious, whereas in the Percy Jackson movies, it felt very much like, oh, well, they're gonna, oh, here we go, another fight scene, oh, well, they're gonna escape, aren't they? You know, there was no real tension because they did that. They sort of shot themselves in the foot a bit and lost a lot of the tension, I think.
And I think that does have to do with the source material. Percy Jackson does have a lot more action in the books than the Harry Potter books do, but I think that they elevated that to extreme levels in the movies. And I think that in the books of Percy Jackson, it's almost character building through the action in a way that the movie doesn't do, whereas Harry Potter, it's character building not only through the action, but through the moments between action, which is also super important.
Yeah, I think that's true. So I think that concludes our video. So thank you very much for watching. I had a lovely time. Thank you so much to Jordan for coming on my channel again. She's fantastic. And again, please go and check out the video we made on her channel, which will be linked down below, and her channel as well, which will be linked down below. And you should definitely go and watch her videos because she is incredibly coherent and really good at getting across her ideas in a really clear, intelligent way, and her video is fantastic. So if you're interested in storytelling, or even if you're not, just, yeah, go and check out her channel. So thank you very much for watching, and goodbye. Camera hasn't died. There we go. I feel like...
That was the cutest outro where you're like, and go watch your videos and bye.
Because I'm so bad at filming intros and outros, and then I was conscious my camera was going to die any second, so I was like trying to talk and then trying to think, and yeah, but hopefully